welcome to this week's History in the Kitchen. My name is Charlene Amidol and I am your hostess for today. I'm just going to set up something very quickly on my computer so that I can see your comments throughout the video, and then we'll get started cooking and we'll do some history. All right, let's get started. So today's History in the Kitchen is all about Latino immigration in the 19th century, so between 1800 and 1900. And the reason I decided to focus on that today is, number one, because I'm a historian, so that's kind of my wheelhouse, kind of my place in history where I am most comfortable. And second, I really think that the story is very interesting and it's very complex, so I tried to distill it down for everybody so that we could understand how many Latinos in the 1800s came into the United States. And quite frankly, besides the fact that it's complex, they were also, most were territorially incorporated. So what territorially incorporated means is that the United States took over territories where these Latino people lived, and they became a part of the United States not because they came here or because they necessarily wanted to or they necessarily didn't want to be part of their territories anymore, but because the United States took over and took them in. So it's a really interesting story. You can be the judge of the morality of the story because I'm here to give you some facts, not necessarily my opinion, though I have one, and you'll probably be able to tell from my face what my opinion is because I'm not super good at hiding it. And we'll get started. The recipe for tonight is black beans and rice. Now, black beans and rice is a traditional Mexican dish, but I'm not making it in the traditional Mexican way. I'm making it in the easy way. I took the easy recipe because, one, I only have half an hour, and two, I'm really starting to flex my Latino food muscles, and I wanted to make sure that I did it right and that it tasted good and that it was something that everybody would want to eat. So ingredients that you're going to need are pre-cooked black beans. I cooked these about 2 hours ago because you have to let them sit in the water for a little while. They were dried, they were in the bag. You need to reserve 1/4 cup of the bean water. So that's what this is, bean broth. Okay. You need a 1/4 cup of onions diced. You need some minced garlic. Okay, and the measurement for the minced garlic is 1 small garlic clove minced, but I really love garlic, so there's 2 small garlic cloves minced in there. If you would like to include cumin, you do need some cumin, just a pinch, and you need a 1/2 teaspoon of oregano, and you need 1.5 cups of cooked rice. There is far more than 1.5 cups of cooked rice in here, but we'll just use what we need, and then I'll reserve the rest for something else. All right, so let's get started with the history, and then we'll get started with the cooking. Oh, and you also need vegetable oil. And your finest skillet. I really love my copper pot, so I'm gonna use my copper pot today. I really overuse that pot. It's a real workhorse. I love the copper pot. All right, so in order for us to understand Latino history in 1800, or between 1800 and 1900, we have to go way, 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 way back to 1492. And the first area of Spanish settlement. The Spanish came in from Europe and they were trying to basically take over the world. And the reason that they were trying to colonize the entire world, or as much of the world as they possibly can, was for gold and glory and God. They wanted gold, they wanted the riches, they wanted the glory to be like the best country ever, and they were doing it to spread Roman Catholicism. So in 1492, when Christopher Columbus lands in this part of the world, the first area of Spanish settlement is going to be in the Caribbean. And Caribbean settlements are going to include modern-day Cuba, modern-day Puerto Rico, and Hispaniola, which is actually the island that the Dominican Republic and Haiti share. And there were very few native inhabitants on those islands, and they were killed by European disease rather quickly, and labor was replaced by enslaved African people. And that's why these islands have really strong African traditions. About 12%, or 6.3 million people, according to the last sentence, of Latino that are Latino, trace their ancestry back to these initial settlements that Spain had in the 1400s, which is pretty mind-blowing. So the largest group of Latinos in the United States, however, is from Mexico. In the early 1500s, the Spanish expeditions from Cuba, so the Spanish are in Cuba. Let's get my handy-dandy globe here. Okay, so the Spanish land in Cuba and Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, okay? And they're going to do some expeditions from Cuba because they heard about this amazing empire called the Aztec Empire over here, just a stone's throw away in Mexico. So now that we know what part of the world we're in, that's pretty promising, okay? And they hear that the Spanish Empire, the Aztec Empire, excuse me, is huge. They hear the Aztec Empire is really super wealthy, and that their streets are paved in, and I quote from a primary source, gems, silver, and gold. So the Spanish go to Mexico and they conquer the Aztecs in 1521. And the indigenous population of Mexico is going to be used for labor. The Aztecs used the indigenous population of Mexico for labor as well, and therefore very few African people were brought to Mexico to be enslaved, which is why they don't have the same kind of racial cultural tradition as the Caribbean islands do, because indigenous Mexicans were exploited for their labor instead. So racial politics in Mexico actually focuses on a group of people called mestizaje, which are people who are white and indigenous that are mixed together. So trade routes are going to end up connecting Havana, Cuba. I'll grab the globe again. So trade routes connect Havana and Mexico. And the Asian markets are connected through the Philippines. So the Spanish have this really nice trade route going. It goes through Acapulco, and then they're going to go, and then they're going to head over to Havana. And in the 18th century, Mexico is a huge producer of silver. So another reason why the Spanish want Mexico is not just for the trade, not just for the gold and the gems, not just for the glory, not just to spread Roman Catholicism, but they also want the silver production in Mexico. So to protect its interests once, Spain takes over Mexico, what they do is they try to settle in modern-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, because that territory is also Mexican territory, or in their minds, their own territory that also belongs to Spain. So they want to thwart England and France and the United States and the Comanches from coming into Mexico, taking over, and taking the silver mines. So the Spanish are really, really worried about Mexico. They see it as a really valuable asset. However, the idea of manifest destiny in the United States is going to come in, it's going to become a U.S. philosophy, and it's going to cause some trouble in this area in the world and in lots of other areas of the world as well. So if you're not familiar with manifest destiny, if you think about the word destiny, it means like the thing that I'm meant to do. So manifest destiny, it means that the United States is meant to, it's their God-given right to spread from East Coast to West Coast and take over everything, because they are the enlightened race, and we need to, in the United States, make sure that everyone else is enlightened too, because everybody else is not enlightened because they're not American. Okay. So notice the facial expression and the raised eyebrow there. This is what people believed in the 1800s in the United States. So there's going to be some trouble between the United States and Mexico and Cuba and Puerto Rico during this time. So let's talk a little bit about Mexican independence, but first, let's go a little bit further back. So Mexico, it becomes independent from Spain in 1810, but we need to go even further back than that to 1803 and the Louisiana Purchase. So Thomas Jefferson purchases this giant chunk of land from France. The United States pays France $15 million for the Louisiana Territory, and it stretches from New Orleans all the way to Alberta, Canada. And when Spain also cedes Florida at this time, they ceded Florida and Louisiana to France, so Spain owned all this territory, then it gets transferred to France. Napoleon needs to fund some global wars, so he sells it to the United States. So the people who are living in this territory are being, their citizenship is being changed, and the rules of what country that is taking over them are being changed all the time. And let's not forget, not only are people from Mexico living in this territory, but there also are native peoples that lived in North America for the longest time who are kind of getting tossed around and not even thought about during this European United States territory grab. So when Spain ceded Florida and Louisiana to France, it encouraged its subjects to move to Texas for free land. So we want the subjects to get out of the land that's owned by France and get into Texas. And then eventually that land that was owned by France, the Louisiana Purchase, is going to be turned over to the United States. So Mexico declares independence from Spain in 1810. And that was supported by Napoleon also. So not only is Napoleon selling this huge chunk of land to the United States, but he also supports Mexican independence because he doesn't want Spain to own Mexico anymore. So when Mexico becomes independent, they're the ones who have to figure out what the borders are in Texas, because there's a dispute over the border of Texas and the Louisiana territory that the United States now owns. So Texas at this point is actually a territory that belongs to Mexico. So I know a lot of us think about Texas as part of the United States for the rest of forever. It wasn't. The first time a European country came in and grabbed land, Spain grabbed Texas, and then when Mexico declared independence from Spain, Texas belonged to Mexico, but it was still called Texas or Tejas. And it was a territory. It wasn't a full-blown Mexican state. It was just a part of Mexico that Mexico ruled. So let's talk a little bit about a couple of Americans that come into the story. Moses Austin of Missouri petitions the town of San Antonio, Texas in 1819, and he wants something called an impresario grant. An impresario grant means that he wants to be able to take a whole bunch of settlers over and settle some land that's cheap or free in Texas. And he was granted permission to settle 300 people, or 300 white families, in Texas. But he died, so Moses Austin drops dead, and his son Stephen has to take over. So Stephen Austin actually does the settling, and in order for people to settle in Texas, they have to do a couple of things. They have to swear allegiance to the Mexican government, so they're no longer American. They have to honor the language and culture of Texas, and they also have to pledge to be Roman Catholic. So they all pledge to be all of these things, and then they're like, yeah, we're not going to do that. No, we're just going to come in, take some land, live for almost free, bring enslaved people, which technically aren't allowed, and we're also not going to follow your rules. Okay. So the Mexican government gives lots of impresario grants, not just to Stephen Austin, and lots of people from the United States move into Texas because they are really interested in expanding their cotton farms. Cotton is a really, really tough plant on the soil, and when people planted cotton in the United States, they would often kill the soil. They weren't able to grow anything else there. The soil would become totally devoid of nutrients. So people continued to move west, and one place that was really great for cotton growing was Texas. So that's why lots of people from the United States moved into Texas, which belongs to Mexico. Okay, so Americans are immigrating to Mexico. Okay, let's remember that. All right, now also there's another group of people that's involved in Texas, and that's the Comanche Tribe. The Comanches are a group of native peoples that lived in this territory, and they were a major force in Texas. So I know a lot of us buy into or believe or think about stereotypes that we learned about native peoples of North America. They were political, they were active militarily, they were actually countries that people needed to deal with, and they still are. Countries that have political affiliation and political ties with other countries. So the Comanche were a major force in Texas. There were thousands and thousands of armed and mounted warriors that the Comanches had in order to protect their territory. And they were also major political actors who played European countries against one another in order to get what they needed, in the same way that European countries played themselves against each other to get what they needed. So historians can go so far, and they do go so far, as to call the Comanche Empire. So these people are not part of the side story. Oftentimes history books are going to talk a lot about, remember the Alamo and the United States conquering an unfair Mexican government in Texas, and that's not necessarily the case. It's not the case that actually happened. So we need to be really careful with our history textbooks and dig a little bit deeper. All right, speaking of digging deeper and digging, really that has no relation to the cooking that we're doing, but we're going to start cooking and then we'll get back to the history. So the first thing that you're going to need to do is you're going to have to put a little bit of vegetable oil. I'm going to be using canola oil into your pot. I'm going to move over so that you can see the pot. And first thing we're doing is we're sauteing our onions and our garlic. So let's turn this up to medium-high heat. Maybe. All right, there it goes. I'm going to turn you all a little bit this way. You'll be able to see my children's shoes in the background. And we'll throw the onions in there. That's a 1/4 cup of onions. And one clove of minced garlic, but like I said, I use 2 because I really like garlic. Okay, so we're going to put all that in there, and we are going to saute these onions until they are transparent, so until we can see through them. All right. So as we are sauteing, I also want to call attention to New Mexico, which was actually very much like Texas in that it was a territory of Mexico. It's actually called the Kingdom of New Mexico, and it includes modern-day New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah, and it was really, really densely populated. So New Mexico is going to have a lot to say about what's going on about the United States taking over territory that people live in. There are also Pueblo people who live in that place as well. So not only do we have the Comanche Empire, but we also have the Pueblo tribe. So foreign immigrants are going to flock to Texas. And by foreign immigrants, I mean people from the United States, Americans. Americans are going to flock to Texas from the United States, and eventually they are going to outnumber what we call Mexican Tejanos, or Tejanos are people who live in Texas who are Mexican. And the Americans and the Tejanos are going to have 4 issues with one another. One of them is, and also the Americans are going to have issues with the Mexican government. So one of them is slavery. Slavery was abolished in Mexico upon independence in 1810. It didn't really stick though, but by 1829, all enslaved people in Mexico were emancipated because the Mexican government saw the Americans bringing tons of enslaved people into Mexico, into Texas, and they were like, no, we don't do slavery here. We don't do that. Please don't bring enslaved people here. You're not allowed to have, we're not allowed to have slavery here. Americans did anyway, and because Texas was so far from the capital in Mexico City, they kind of got away with whatever they wanted. The next issue was religion. Some people converted to Roman Catholicism as per the agreement, and in 1824, the Mexican government declared Roman Catholicism to be the official religion of Mexico, and the United States, the immigrants from the United States, the American immigrants, were like, yeah, no, we're not doing that, and they didn't. So that was part of it. They fought tooth and nail to keep slavery and to not have to be Roman Catholic. Texans also felt that they had minimal representation in the capital, and they really wanted more representation. And the reason they wanted more representation was so that they could try to keep slavery. They wanted to fight to keep slavery. So foreign immigrants or United States immigrants start moving into Texas in like the 1820s. And by 1835, Texas is going to declare its independence from Mexico under Steve Austin. So if you're thinking about it here, the Tejanos are not the ones that are declaring independence. Some Tejanos did want independence from Mexico, especially the wealthier ones, but there were many Tejanos who were like, no, we are Mexican, and we need to stay as part of the Mexican government. Texas belongs to Mexico, but the American immigrants in Mexico did not, in Texas, Mexican Texas, didn't see it that way. And in 1835, under Austin and Sam Houston, Texas declared independence. So many of the Tejanos actually wanted to remain loyal Mexicans because they thought that Texan independence was a ploy for slavery, to keep slavery, and they were right. Now, in order to get people on their side, the war for Texan independence was racialized. So basically what people were saying was that Mexicans were unfit for self-government, and that they were cruel and cowardly and indolent and ignorant. So a lot of that propaganda was floating around. And by 1836, Texas became independent. They were victorious, but they were extremely poor. Anglo immigrants and slaves, so American immigrants and enslaved people, poured in, and American newcomers decided that they were going to declare their whiteness. They were like, we are white, we are part of this manifest destiny thing, and if you are Tejano, if you are Mexican, you are not white. You are an inferior class, you need to be laborers, and eventually Tejanos face terrible discrimination because they're outnumbered by Americans who don't like them. They're segregated, and they're neglected and abused by the Texan government. So things are not going well for people who are native to Texas and and their land got taken over. And then by 1845, Texas is annexed by the United States. So James K. Polk, the president at the time, brings Texas in, and Mexico was like, hold on a second, wait a minute. For years, Americans have been pouring into Texas, and then Americans declared independence, and now you're taking over. Was this planned? Because this does not look good. It looks like you were just trying to take our territory and trying to take over our people. All right, so and we'll continue on that in a moment. Your onions should be transparent at this point. So we're gonna add our beans, throw our beans in the skillet, and we're gonna cook this for about 2 minutes. We really want the beans to get the flavor of the onions and the garlic. So we're gonna keep this on medium heat, not medium high at this point. And we're going to stir. While these are cooking, we can talk a little bit more. All right, so James K. Polk didn't stop at Texas, though. James K. Polk also promised that we would take over California, Oregon, Utah, New Mexico. So he actually does some kind of shady stuff in order to get it. And by kind of shady, I mean totally shady. James K. Polk was totally shady. So what he does is he sends an ambassador to Mexico City to try to purchase all this territory, and the Mexicans were like, no. That's ours, you can't have it. And when they said no, James K. Polk decided that he was going to very surreptitiously invade California and Oregon. So he sends a man, his name is John C. Fremont, on a scientific expedition. Okay, so what the scientific expedition really was John C. Fremont went out to California, arrested a Mexican commander, and declared California independent. Now, there were native Mexican people who lived in California too, and their opinions were also not taken into consideration. They were called Californios. Now, James K. Polk also devised this kind of not true border dispute about Texas ending at the Rio Grande River, the border being the Rio Grande River, which would give the Americans more territory in Texas, whereas the Mexicans were like, no, actually what we had settled many years ago is that the border is at the Nueces River. So if we look at Texas, and it's going to be super small, but I'm going to try to show you anyhow. Okay, you guys all over there can see Texas, and I shouldn't say you guys because everybody might not be a guy, you might have folks. Okay, so right here, is your, right here is your Nueces River. Hopefully you can see that. And over here is the Rio Grande. So this whole area was disputed. And James K. Polk basically provokes the Mexican people. He sends the army there. During peacetime, there was no declared war. Some accidental shots go off, and James K. Polk was like, the Mexicans shot first, so now we're going to have a war. So we get into this full-on war with Mexico. It's called the Mexican-American War. And by the end of the Mexican-American War, we get the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. And basically, the Mexicans signed this treaty under duress because Polk sent the army to Mexico City, and the United States bombarded Mexico City until they would surrender. And Mexico had extremely unfavorable terms in this treaty. Mexico acknowledged the Rio Grande as the border, so they gave up all of that territory, plus they gave up 55% more of their territory. So they gave up California, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. And in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, this is where we get to our immigration piece, because the borders of Mexico moved. And just because the borders of Mexico moved does not mean the Mexican people who lived there moved, nor did the native peoples who lived there move. Now, the native peoples who lived there were kept almost completely out of the picture. They weren't considered at all. Now, the people who were from Mexico were considered sort of. So Article 8 of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo says that Mexican citizens had 1 year to leave the territory, and if they didn't leave in 1 year, they would automatically become American citizens. Article 9 said that all of this territory would be incorporated into the United States, and Mexican residents would enjoy American citizenship. So the United States brought all of these people and said, if you don't move, you're American citizens, and made them citizens. And then lastly, the only reference to the native peoples who lived there, so the Comanche and the Apache and the Pueblo, is that the U.S. would police them. And They make some terrible references and they call them some terrible names in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, including savage tribes that need to be pushed back. So that's the only acknowledgement that Native peoples got from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the rest of the people who lived there, whether they could move out or not in 1 year, they had 1 year to go. You either get out or you become American. So territorial expansion actually brought these people into the United States, and they were pretty unwilling. There was significant resistance because they felt that they were Mexican, and they were, and they felt that that the borders should not have been changed, that their allegiance should still be to Mexico, and that the war was unfair. And manifest destiny, remember, is driving this war. The United States believes that they are the superior civilization that needs to bring civilization to lots of other people. So there was significant resistance, especially in California and New Mexico, to American rule. Eventually, the people who resisted, the Mexican people who resisted, were overpowered, especially when they tried to resist formally. They would continue with some guerrilla activity and eventually form political parties to try and make sure that their rights were protected. And it didn't necessarily work out that way for them. All right, so we're going to talk for a moment about Cuba and Puerto Rico, but I do want to put in the rest of our ingredients. So we're going to stir in the cooked rice, and remember, we only need 1.5 cups of this cooked rice. So I'm going to grab my cup. I made entirely too much, but that's okay. And hopefully I don't need to remind you to wash your hands at this point because you've already done so. We've been cooking for a while. So throw in your 1.5 cups. I'm actually going to put in 2 cups because I have a lot of beans. So we're going to do 2 cups, maybe a little bit more because I overestimated my beans. All right, so since I put in so many beans, I want to even it out with the rice, so I put in 2.5 cups. And we're going to stir this in. And then we are also, oh, that looks really nice. Check that out. Isn't that beautiful? Oh, love it. And we're also going to put our bean broth in, so don't forget to take your bean broth and put your bean broth in here. Probably could have used a little more bean broth, but that's okay. So we've got our bean broth in there, and we're going to cook this until everything is hot, which means that we're going to be able to talk about Puerto Rico and Cuba, which is excellent. So we were talking about the 1840s. When we were talking about James K. Polk, we're going to fast forward to 1898. And in 1898, the U.S. feared an independence movement in Cuba. The independence movement in Cuba was led mostly by people of African descent. And in the United States, people were really afraid of that because they didn't want resistance in the black population in Cuba to spill over to resistance in the black population in the United States, because as we know, Jim Crow is beginning, and discrimination and prejudice are in full swing in the United States against black people in 1898. Not that it ever wasn't, but things are still not good in 1898, just like they're still not great now. So the United States also really, really wants Cuba, because Cuba, let's get the map, let's get the globe again. Cuba is right here. Whoop, there it is. And it is an amazing naval base. It's great. It's right there in the Atlantic. We can get to the United States. We can get to Mexico. We can get across the Atlantic. So Cuba's a really great naval base, number one. And number two, it's the largest grower of sugarcane in the entire world. And so the U.S. really, really wants to try to take over Cuba. Cuba, however, is owned by Spain. The United States also wants Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico also still taken over by Spain. So eventually, Cuba is taken in. The United States and Spanish forces clash in 1898. The war is really short. The United States dominates, and for $20 million, Spain gave up Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, other Caribbean islands, parts of American Samoa. So in case you don't know where American Samoa is, and also the Philippines. So here you have the Philippines. I'm working on a mirror view so that you all can read this stuff. So here's the Philippines right here, okay? And there you go, okay. So, oh, I didn't show you Samoa, sorry. And American Samoa, well, it's called American Samoa now, but Samoa is right here in the Pacific, Okay, now, I want you to ask yourselves, or you can ask me, how many Cubans, Filipinos, or Puerto Ricans were involved in this sale of their island to the United States from Spain? I will give you one guess. If you guess 0, you are absolutely correct. 0. No Puerto Ricans were consulted about what their fate would be. No Filipinos were consulted about what their fate would be, and no Cubans were consulted about what their fate would be after the Spanish and American War in 1898. And even when we say Spanish-American War, we are not including any of the people who were involved. We're talking about Spain, an empire, the United States, basically an empire, and all of the people that are stakeholders here, the people who will be affected, not involved. So Cuba and Puerto Rico, the Philippines, all taken in, and these people become American. They become not quite American citizens, but they live in American territories, and they are ruled by the American government. So if we're thinking about Latino Latino immigration, we're also thinking about people who were brought in that did not have a say. So just like the Mexicans did not want to become American at that point because their territory had been taken over, no Cubans or Puerto Ricans were consulted, so they may not have wanted to become a part of America either. But their immigration, the immigration that we talk about here, is all about territorial expansion, and that they were territorially incorporated into the United States. So there's not movement going on their part between 1800 and 1900. There's movement going on between European and American powers over which they have no control. So residents of Spain, Mexico, Cuba, and Puerto Rico are eventually going to come to the United States. They come to the United States through wars of territorial expansion between 1800 and 1900. In the 20th century, Mexico and Cuba have social revolutions that are a totally different history in the kitchen, but that's going to propel citizens here. But between 1800 and 1900, citizens of Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Cuba are not propelled into the United States. There's no pull factor, there's no push factor, except for powers that don't take them into any consideration, having them become absorbed. So there's your history for today. We're going to finish our dish by putting in a pinch of cumin. So literally, I'm going to pinch it in. I'm actually going to put in 2 pinches of cumin because I really like cumin, and also I made kind of a bigger dish than I normally would have. And we're also going to put in a half a teaspoon of oregano. Okay. All right. Okay. And we're going to stir that in. And there you have a delicious dish. Now, recommendations for serving: fried plantains. I try not to fry on History in the Kitchen because I'm not sure who's cooking or if there are kids cooking, and I don't want them to. I don't want the oil to jump on them. Or some delicious guacamole. I thought about doing guacamole on History in the Kitchen, but I also know that avocados can be fickle, so I wanted to make sure that I had ripe avocados for you. So this week we have our black beans and rice. I can't wait to eat this. I'm going to save some of it for dinner tomorrow too, because I made quite a bit. Thank you so much for joining me on History in the Kitchen today. I was so pleased to share my knowledge of the Mexican-American War with you, and a little bit about the Spanish-American War, which really was between Spain and the United States, but involved tons of other people who had no say. I hope you learned a little bit about Latino immigration. I hope you are celebrating Hispanic Latino Heritage Month in lots of ways, including cooking and shopping at Hispanic Latino businesses, etc. And learning just like we are today. If you would like to follow me or follow my blog, you can find me at www.teachinghistoryherway.com, just like my apron says. You can also find me on Instagram at Teaching History Her Way, where I post some things that I'm doing in my classroom, and I also post about history in the kitchen. I also post those things on my blog, but on Instagram they're a little bit shorter. You can find me on Twitter at just History Her Way, because Twitter didn't give me enough characters, and you can also follow me here. Please share this video. I know it's over, but some people like to watch it and cook afterwards, and maybe rewatch to get some of the history. I would really like, the reason I do this is because I really like to share history with you. I really like for everybody to see lots of different perspectives. History is made by people of every shade, and the sooner we come to appreciate that, the sooner our world is going to be a better place. So please give this a share. I do this totally for free and on my own time, so it's not like like you're sharing it and I'm getting paid for it. You're sharing it because I genuinely love history and I genuinely love seeing you. So thank you very much for seeing me this week, and I will see you next time on History in the Kitchen. Have a great weekend.